Hey, welcome back to another video. This video is going to be on me building a data table with Livewire. This time around, it's going to be with selectable checkboxes in each row that you can use to edit selected rows or delete them, whatever. This is actually something that was a request from a viewer on the last data table video, which I thought was really interesting. And I wanted to just jump in and get this created because I was just curious myself on how hard it would be. Just a quick note before I start, I wanted to thank you all for subscribing. I'm now into month three and a half, I think, of recording videos, and I'm at 280 something subscribers, which is crazy to me. Subscribing is the best way to support this channel, and I really appreciate you all doing that, so thank you. To get started, we just need to generate a new Laravel project. So Laravel new Livewire selectable data table. Next, I'm just going to cd into that and install Livewire, which is done with composer require Livewire. Okay, I'm on a Mac and I use Valet to serve my Laravel projects, PHP projects rather. So I'm going to use Valet link and Valet secure. And now, theoretically, if I go into my browser, I should see a fresh Laravel project with Livewire installed, which I do. So just to be clear, I'm using Laravel version 8 and PHP 8. I'm going to try to stick to like PHP 7.4 syntax, whatever, just to keep it comparable when watching if you're not using PHP 8 yet. But I don't really see anything that would change drastically because I'm using PHP 8. So this should be pretty useful for everyone. Just to get started, let's open up this project and kind of see what's going on in here. A Laravel project by default comes with a user model, which we see here. The new Laravel version, the latest release, has a has factory trait, which uses which means user model can now use user factory, the new style factories, which we're going to use to see the database so we have data to actually show within our data table. But before we do all that, we need to see our environment file, make sure that the values are correct. And our database name value by default is this. I've actually gone ahead and actually created this beforehand here. So livewire underscore selectable underscore data table. And as you can see, there's nothing in here. So I'm good to get going on this. We can get started. Let's open up the database seeder. As you can see, Laravel's already provided some basic factory that was commented out, but we're going to write it a little bit differently. So we need to import user factory times 50 because I want 50 records, and I want each record to have specific values in a certain column, and that column is created at. I want created at to be random for each user so that it's easy to see that sorting actually works inside the data table correctly. If they all have the same value, then it's really difficult to do that. And the way we do this within the state array is we use the column we want to edit or set as the key, and then the value we want to set as obviously the value. So the way I want to do this is now sub minutes, and then a random amount of minutes between 0 and 59. And you'd think this would work, and it technically will, but the problem is that this will actually generate one random time and then set that one random time for each record. And that kind of defeats the whole purpose of setting this in the first place. The way I get around this is just by setting this like so. This is a shorthand PHP function. I think that was introduced in PHP 7.4, and basically this wraps the random generation, I think, in what's called a closure. But this closure will now be evaluated every time a user record is being created. Therefore, it will be random, and we'll see that that's the case in a second. So if I just clear this, we can run PHP artisan migrate. So if we go back to here, refresh, go into users, you can see that our tables are created. Now we can run PHP artisan db seed, and this will seed our database. And you can see that we have 50 user records, 50 rows in table, and they all have random timestamps. That works fine. Pro tip, if you want to migrate fresh, so rerun migrations and seed at the same time, you can run PHP artisan migrate fresh seed. And that will reseed. So if we refresh, the data is fresh, the migrations are fresh, but it's all seeded. I try to alias as much as I can in commands that I find myself running frequently. So I use MFS to alias to this within my Zish file, and that speeds up my development time a lot because I run this many times within a day, usually at work. So that's pro tip. That's what I would do. I would alias everything you're running many times just to speed up your development process. Moving on, I think that we can actually get to creating a component. And the way we do this is by running PHP artisan make Livewire, and we can call this component users table. And that creates the users table class and the users table.blade.php template file. And if we want to go back in our editor now, we can actually see that this is the case. So that's what a typical Livewire component looks like when you're just starting out. And this is what the template file looks like, which has just a quote in it commented out. So what we're going to do just to start is make sure that we include a trait that you have to use with Livewire if you're going to use pagination, and that is called use with pagination. And make sure that that is actually imported. My editor does that for me. And then in here, we're going to be defining a bunch of public properties to use within our template that I will get to in a second. First, we want to see that we can actually render this out into the browser. So in our web file, which is where our main routes are kept, right now for the root route, which is the only one defined, we're outputting the welcome view. And we can reuse this route and instead just output the users table component. And this also has to be imported. My editor just did that as well. So keep in mind, this has to be imported as well here for it to work. If we go back to the browser and refresh, we're going to get an error. And that's because view layouts.app does not exist. If we're outputting components from here, Livewire will try to slot the component template into a app.blade.php file within the resources views layouts directory. And that's really confusing, I'm sure, if you're listening to me right now, but basically what's happening is Livewire is trying to find a file within resources, views, and layouts. This does not exist in our project because we did not install any authentication scaffolding or anything like that for authentication UI. And that's typically where any Laravel package would put that main layouts app.blade.php file. So we can create our own app.blade.php. And lucky me, I'm just going to copy it over from the last project because this has nothing to do with Livewire basically. But if we look here, I'm basically just including some basic HTML. It's got a head and a body, and I've included Tailwind, Font Awesome, which I doubt I'll use, and the Nunito font, which I happen to like. And most importantly, at the bottom of the head, I'm including @Livewire styles, and at the bottom of the body, I'm including @Livewire scripts. So this is where Livewire actually injects its resources. I'm not sure if that's the right term, but that's where the Livewire stuff gets loaded in. And that is absolutely necessary. If you are using Livewire and your components they render, but they don't seem to work, it's not reactive, that's probably one of the reasons why you might not be loading the scripts or the styles correctly. Now, I've also included a user's header in here. Not the best place for it if you're going to be reusing this file. This should be within the component, but for the purpose of this tutorial, that's going to be left in here. And the only thing left to do is to use a slot to allow Livewire to actually inject that component into here. So I'm going to use a class container, which will limit the width, and MX auto, which will center this div horizontally. And within here, we just use a blade slot. If I reload the browser now, there should be no error. You can see users comes up, but how do we know that that actual template file from the component is being loaded? Well, we can go ahead and just put some text in here. And there we go. So the text is coming up, and that's being loaded from the users-table.blade.php component template file. And that means that our component is being actually rendered, which is great. So the next step will actually be to make the page look like the last tutorial's data table page. And I'm just going to copy over that as well. And I'm going to remove these because this will break the page. And I'm also going to go up here and remove wire model per page. So if I reload now, you see that we have a search, a drop down for columns that we want to sort by, the sort direction, and the per page value for pagination. And we have the table with no values in it. And there's no values in it because we're not actually passing in any users, and we're not looping over those users within the template file. So we can actually start by defining a search method. Well, actually, let's start in the component. What we want to do is edit the render method. Within the render method, we're just returning a view, livewire.users-table, right here. That's the one right here. How we pass in data within Livewire is just by including an array of data as a second parameter in the view here. And we want to use the key users, and we want the user model, which was just imported. You have to import that. And we want to search. We want to order by a certain column. For now, we can order by, let's say, created at, which exists on the table in descending order. And we want to simple paginate. Let's say for a default 10 records per page. So that's why we included with pagination. The only thing that's going to break here is that the search doesn't actually exist. This method does not exist on a user. And that's exactly what this error is. It just doesn't exist. And I got this method from a Caleb Porzio screencast, the creator of Livewire, and I'm not sure if this is the best way to go about this. Maybe a scope would be better, I'm not entirely sure, but this is the way he does it, so this is the way I've been kind of doing it since I watched that. So we want to make a public static function search method, and we want to pass in a search value. And within here, we want to return this is basically scoping down the query to only include records that match our search criteria. We want to first check if the search value passed in as a parameter is empty. If it is empty, we're going to return it using a ternary. We're going to return static query. If this value is not empty though, we want to return a static where ID like search, and we want to copy this because we also want to search on the name, and we also want to search on the email. Oh, looks like we're missing a colon here. And there we go. So what's going to happen here is if the search is empty, meaning like an empty string value, it's going to return just an empty query, so nothing will change. There's going to be no limiting or constraints on the user query. If, however, there is a value in here, it's going to include records that only match 3 constraints here. So if the search is within the ID, the name, or the email, we want to include those records. Something to note here, where actually escapes values. So there's no risk for SQL injection as far as I know here. And so it's totally fine to search this way using like. So that works. And now if we refresh our browser, we should see that nothing's changed, but at least there's no error. And we can go back to here and implement some of the public properties we need to actually track for this component to work. However, the first thing we could do is get users to actually be outputted, because right now we have 50 users in the table, but none of them are coming up because we're not actually rendering them on the front end. And so the way I'm going to do this is by first wrapping this table with an if, and we're going to check if users is not empty. If users is not empty, we want to output a table with the user data. Else, we want to only output this whoops, no users are found message. And within the table here, we want to put a for each users as user, and for each. And within here, we can put user ID, name, email, and created at. Now the created at date is going to be pretty ugly. As you can see, our records do come up, which is great, but the created at date time is pretty ugly. So I typically just for demos use diff for humans to make it obvious what's happening. And what this will do is create it to something really easy and readable. So this does actually work. The only thing missing is pagination, and I'm sure you might have noticed that. So the easy fix for this is to just include the pagination links. Laravel allows you to basically do the collection of models you are trying to output, arrow links, and it will render the buttons you need for you, which is amazing. So the next step will be getting the search and the sorting and pagination stuff to work. And this is actually very simple. but we just need to define some public properties. If you're familiar with JavaScript like Vue, React style development, you'll know that you have to store some sort of data properties within your components. And the way this is done here is by basically defining public properties like so. So public search is equal to empty by default. Public per page is equal to 10 for pagination by default. Public sort, call it sort field. We can let this be ID by default. And public sort ascending. We can make this true by default. So we will be sorting in ascending order by default. And we can now replace these empty values here with these public properties. So the way this is done is user search and pass in this search, which will now reference the value in here. And once these are changed, we will have to wire up we'll have to bind the values within the template to actually change the values within our component here. And we can change this out for this sort field. And here, because we are storing a sort ascending Boolean, we actually need to check. So if sort ascending, we want to output ascending. If not, we want to output descending. And in here, we will use this per page, which was by default 10. If we reload, you'll see that not much has changed. These still don't work because they're not actually binded to those public properties, but at least we didn't break anything. So we can now go ahead and actually bind these values. This search input that you see here is actually this input right here. And the way we do this is bind is basically by using wire :model is equal to search. And this search here is going to be referencing this public property here. And now if we refresh, and let's say I search Orvel, only that record comes up because there's only one record that matches in either the ID, name, or email, this search term. If I type something really random, you'll see that our if condition there of only showing table if there are users is working. So if users is not empty, show table, else show whoops, no users were found. You can see that it's actually working because no users exist with this search term. We need to also make sure that these work, right? And these are just as easy to do. So right here is the selector for which field to sort by. And we can use wire model equals to sort field. And also down here we have sort ascending. And the way this works is we can use wire model equal to sort ascending. And you'll notice that the sort ascending value within the component here, this public property, I've actually hard coded in 1 or 0 for ascending and descending. 1 will evaluate to true, 0 will evaluate to false, and we will respect the Boolean type here. So it will work. And lastly, we can actually set wire model per page. And now we can search, let's say A, well, okay, which will bring up a ton of records. Let's say AN, so it's finding AN in every record. We can sort by name, which is done in alphabetical order. We can reverse alphabetical order, so it'll start from backwards. And we can change how many records show up on a page. So right now I've set to 25. There's less than 25 records, so there's no pagination links. But if I go back to 10 and click next, it'll show the next 10, which is great. And there's no more records to show, so this button doesn't work. So that actually is perfect. So we have a working data table, and this is exactly what we wanted. Now the next step is actually getting these, when I select them, to do something. My decision on what to do here is basically I just want to have a button when I select this to be able to delete these records. And so what I want to do is repurpose the per page thing here. I'm not really interested in having this here just for this tutorial because it's pretty simple and I'd rather just have a delete button here. So I'm just going to remove this and in its place paste in a button that I've pre-built because detailing how the Tailwind CSS part of this tutorial came together would take way too long. But this button is styled in a way to replicate the style of all the other form elements. All I've changed basically is just change background to red 500 and the text to white. If I refresh here, we get a delete button, which is awesome. So we have something to delete with. As soon as I wire that up and make a method for it that will delete selected records, but before I do that, I need to be able to select the records I want to delete in the first place. And I think for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to try to increase the per page to 25. So maybe we have some more data to test with. And I also want to create a new public property called selected, which will be set to an empty array. The cool thing about the way Livewire's wire model works is that you can set the same wired model binding on multiple checkboxes. And what will happen is if you have multiple checkboxes selected, it'll add the value of the checkbox into the property as array elements. It's going to be very difficult to demonstrate this. Maybe I can show you as we work through it. So I have the checkboxes here and within the users table. And it's just a basic checkbox. Nothing else has changed. What I want to do is add a wire model and bind it to selected, the public property I just created. And I also want to add a value. And now this value has to identify the record that is being selected so that I can then find that value and remove it if delete is clicked. And now what better way to do that than to basically identify this record by the user ID. So user ID. So the way we make this work now that we have the wire model selected, bind it here, and we're passing in the user ID as a value, which is the best way to track which record this is. The way we want to output this, and I think this would be the best way outside of maybe dumping it inside the render method, is to just set up the method that we'll need for deleting records anyways inside of the component class. So I'm going to call this remove users. Maybe delete users would be better. And we don't need to pass anything in, but what we could do is just dd, which is die and dump selected. And this will just output the selected value stored in here, and then we'll see exactly how this works. We'll just need to bind this button to the component action there. So this would be wire, I believe, click is equal to delete users. So when this button is clicked, it should fire off this action here, and we should potentially see it work. Let's see. If we check a bunch of random ones here and click delete, and that's perfect. We get the IDs of the records we're selecting, and just to make sure 1, 2, 5, 6, this would be 1, 2, 5, and 6. It works exactly as expected. Now it's just a matter of looping over these users, which we don't actually even need to do because Laravel includes a way to delete multiple records at a time. If we just use user delete and pass in this arrow selected, or maybe destroy. I believe destroy is the correct one. Destroy. So if we destroy, if we look into the source here, allows us to pass in multiple IDs. And since we have an array of IDs here, we might as well do exactly that. If we go back to this page here, refresh, and select 1 and 2 and click delete, 1 and 2 is now gone. If we look inside of our database here, you can see that 1 and 2 records are gone. I'm going to delete records with ID 11, 12, 13, and 14. Delete. Let's see. So 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14 are missing because we only have 10 and 15. So it's doing exactly what we thought it would. And I think this works pretty well. So that's it for this tutorial, I believe. Once again, I'd like to thank all of you for subscribing. It's a huge help, and I hope this was helpful. Please do let me know if you have any ideas for future videos, and I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.